My name is Olivia Cecilia. I am 32 years old, and last month in Los Angeles I finally ended a lifetime of gaslighting. Growing up, I was forced to be the exhausted live-in caregiver for my golden child sister's minor sniffles. Meanwhile, my own severe illnesses were constantly dismissed as dramatic. At our massive family reunion, my mother clinked her glass to praise my sister's resilience. Then she looked at the crowd and publicly called me a selfish disappointment for moving away. I didn't scream or cry. I calmly walked to the head table and dropped a heavy 500-page hospital binder directly onto her plate. It contained decades of documented physical neglect, verified by hospital administrators. Welcome back to my channel, where quiet people finally stand up, and the truth always does the heavy lifting. Before I reveal the exact moment, the room went dead silent hit-like, and tell me your age in the comments. I work as a healthcare compliance auditor. My days are spent tracing discrepancies in medical billing. I sit at a desk in downtown Los Angeles reading line items, looking for the exact moment a charge deviates from the truth. The irony is that, for 8 years I funded a discrepancy in my own life. I refused to look at the math, because looking at the math meant looking at my family. Growing up in our house meant living in the shadow of Chloe's lungs. My younger sister had mild childhood asthma. My parents, Brenda and Tom, treated her diagnosis like a fragile glass exhibit. The air filters in our home hummed in every room. Chloe did not carry groceries. She did not mow the lawn. She did not take the bus. If she coughed at breakfast, Brenda's hand would immediately press against her forehead, and the day's schedule would pivot. My role was the scaffolding. When Chloe felt anxious about her breathing, Brenda kept me home from school to sit beside her bed. She settles better when you are here, Livy, Brenda would say, handing me a glass of water to bring to my sister. The assumption was never voiced as a demand. It was framed as a duty. Good sisters absorb the weight. I moved out at 24. I rented a cramped studio apartment near a freeway overpass in Culver City. I carried my boxes down the stairs, while Brenda stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest. She did not say she was proud of me. She asked who was going to manage Chloe's nebulizer schedule during the dry season. The guilt followed me down the interstate. It sat in the passenger seat of my car and echoed through the phone calls that came every Sunday. Brenda's voice would drop into a soft, breathy register, listing the costs of Chloe's out-of-network respiratory specialists. "We are stretching every dollar," she would say, pausing just long enough for the silence to do the work. I broke under the quiet pressure. During my second month in that apartment, earning an entry-level salary that barely covered my rent, I offered to pay for Chloe out-of-network respiratory specialists. $600 a month. Brenda accepted the offer before I finished the sentence. "It is just until she gets her footing," she said. Chloe is now 30. Her footing remains elusive. For 8 years, a scheduled transfer left my account on the first of the month. I tracked corporate fraud by day, and by night, I ate rice and beans to ensure my sister kept seeing her private specialists. Around my 28th birthday, the dull ache in my lower abdomen began. A low, rhythmic throb that woke me up at 2 in the morning. I ignored it. When the pain sharpened, spreading into my back, I took ibuprofen and went to work. I had the basic high-deductible insurance plan provided by my firm. A specialist visit meant out-of-pocket costs I did not have. The $600 a month I sent to Brenda was the margin I needed to see a doctor. I tried to bring it up once during a Sunday dinner at their house. I was pressing a hot water bottle to my stomach. Across the table, Chloe was happily unwrapping a new designer leather handbag. She modeled it over her shoulder and smiled, saying she decided to treat herself since her living expenses were so low lately. "I think something is wrong," I said. "The pain is not stopping." Brenda did not look up from admiring Chloe's new purchase. "Everyone gets cramps, Olivia. Chloe had a near asthma attack yesterday because the neighbor burned leaves." We spent 3 hours at the clinic. "Try a heating pad and do not make a scene." I put the water bottle down. I did not make a scene. I drove back to my apartment, curled on the bathroom floor, and convinced myself that my pain was ordinary. I believed her narrative. I told myself I lacked Chloe's resilience, that I was simply sensitive, that enduring discomfort was just another form of duty. I kept paying the premium. I kept auditing other people's records. And I let my own body quietly deteriorate right up until the afternoon, my vision blurred in the middle of a staff meeting. It happened on a Tuesday during a quarterly compliance review. I was sitting at a conference table with 3 regional directors going over coding errors. I felt a sharp pull in my lower right side. I thought it was just the usual ache I had grown accustomed to. I adjusted my posture and kept reading the report. 5 minutes later, the pull turned into a tear. It felt like a hot wire had been driven straight through my abdomen. I stood up to excuse myself, and my legs simply stopped working. I hit the carpet. The last thing I heard before passing out was the regional director calling for an ambulance. I woke up in a room at Cedars-Sinai. The lights were too bright, and an IV dripped saline into my arm. A resident doctor stood at the foot of my bed, holding a tablet. He looked at me with a mixture of professional calm and genuine pity. He told me I had suffered a ruptured ovarian cyst. He explained that the rupture was severe and that there was extensive scarring around the surrounding tissue. He asked how long I had been ignoring the pain. I told him I thought it was normal. He stopped scrolling on his tablet and looked me right in the eye. He said, "Pain that drops you to the floor is never normal." The nurse handed me my belongings in a plastic bag. I found my phone and called my parents. I expected the reaction any daughter would expect. I expected panic. I expected my mother to ask what room I was in and tell me they were on their way. Brenda answered on the second ring. I told her I was in the hospital. I told her about the emergency surgery they had to perform to stop the internal bleeding. There was a pause on the line. It was not a pause of shock. It was the sound of a woman recalculating her schedule. "Oh, Olivia," she said. Her voice carried the tight, strained pitch she used when she was managing a crisis. "That is so unfortunate. But we cannot come down there right now. Chloe heard the word hospital, and she is having a panic episode. Her breathing is shallow, and we are trying to keep her calm. You know how sensitive she gets about medical things." I lay in that hospital bed, listening to the hum of the cardiac monitor. My sister was having a panic attack because I was in surgery, and my mother was staying home to comfort her. I told Brenda I understood, and I hung up. I did not cry. Crying requires energy I did not possess. Instead, I stared at the blank whiteboard on the wall opposite my bed. The nurse walked in a few hours later with discharge paperwork and a preliminary estimate of my financial responsibility. The number printed at the bottom of the page was staggering. Even with my company insurance, the out-of-pocket cost for the emergency room, the surgery, and the anesthesia equated to 3 months of my salary. I looked at that number, and then I thought about the $600 that would automatically leave my checking account on Friday to pay for Chloe and her out-of-network respiratory care. The fog finally lifted. I was going into debt to fix an organ that ruptured because I could not afford preventative care. I could not afford preventative care because I was funding the life of a 30-year-old woman who was currently being coddled through a panic attack regarding my own medical emergency. I took 2 weeks of medical leave to recover in my Culver City apartment. I spent those days walking carefully around my small kitchen and treating my own life the way I treat a corporate compliance account. I needed data. The resident doctor had mentioned that the scarring indicated years of chronic untreated inflammation. He asked if I had a history of untreated pelvic pain in my adolescence. I could not remember seeing a doctor for anything other than a basic physical. My childhood was a blur of waiting rooms, but we were always waiting for Chloe. I submitted a formal legal request for my complete medical records. Standard retention laws meant most hospitals purged files after a decade. But I am an auditor. I tracked down the off-site data center where our old clinic digitized their legacy archives and treated my own past like a corporate audit. 4 months later, a heavy cardboard box arrived at my door. I carried it to my kitchen table, cut the tape, and lifted out 500 pages. The documented history of my physical existence. I made a pot of coffee and sat down with a bright yellow highlighter. I skipped the growth charts. I was looking for the pain. Sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, the sterile medical jargon felt cold against my skin. Every time I found a dismissed symptom, I dragged the neon ink across the stark white paper, marking the exact moments I was abandoned. I found the first instance when I was 12. Dr. Evans noted severe abdominal cramping during a routine visit. The next page showed a referral to a pediatric specialist. The referral was never fulfilled. I kept reading. The pattern emerged with chilling clarity. Year after year, the pain was documented. 18 separate times across a decade, different doctors had flagged my chronic symptoms. 18 times, they recommended ultrasounds, specialist consultations, or pain management protocols. And right beneath those medical recommendations were the administrative notes detailing the interactions with the parent. I ran my highlighter over the text. The ink bled slightly into the paper. The words were sterile, but the meaning was a physical blow. A note from when I was 14 read mother declined specialist referral citing financial constraints, prioritizing younger sibling medical care. Another note from an emergency room visit when I was 16 stated mother requested patient be discharged without imaging stating patient is likely exaggerating symptoms due to sibling recent asthma diagnosis. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, reading those words over and over. Brenda was not a cartoon villain plotting my demise. She was a woman, obsessively fixated on one child to the detriment of the other. In her mind, Chloe was the fragile center of the universe. My pain was an inconvenience. It was a distraction from her primary mission. Her maternal instinct was profoundly distorted. She convinced herself that I was robust and dramatic, so she would not have to divert resources away from her golden child. But a distorted belief does not change physical reality. By denying me care, she forced my body to endure a decade of untreated inflammation. The medical file concluded with the recent surgical report. The untreated condition had caused irreversible tissue damage. My left ovary was compromised permanently. I had paid the ultimate physical price for her psychological obsession. If you have ever realized that the people supposed to protect you were the ones holding you down, you know the exact kind of cold focus that takes over your brain. I closed the file. I did not throw the binder. I did not scream. I felt a profound icy calm. I knew I had to stop the medical payments. But simply canceling a bank transfer was no longer enough. Canceling a payment silently would just give Brenda the opportunity to tell the family I was being cruel and unstable. She would control the narrative, just like she controlled my medical care. 2 days later, an expensive embossed envelope arrived in my mail. It was an invitation to our massive family reunion. 70 relatives were flying into Los Angeles for a banquet event Brenda had been planning for a year. She wanted to celebrate the family legacy. I looked at the heavy 500-page binder resting on my kitchen table. Then I looked at the invitation. The venue was booked. The audience was confirmed. The audit was complete. I knew exactly where I was going to deliver my findings. The banquet hall in downtown Los Angeles smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted garlic. 70 relatives had flown in from across the country to fill the rented space with the loud, overlapping chatter that defines our family gatherings. I drove to the venue with the windows down, trying to clear my head. I parked my car in the adjacent lot. The 500-page medical file sat in my trunk, secured inside a thick black binder. I left it there. I did not want a spectacle. I wanted a transition. My goal was administrative. I planned to pull Brenda aside before dessert, hand her the billing transfer paperwork, and inform her that I was stepping down as Chloe's financial sponsor. A clean handoff. I walked into the hall and immediately felt the familiar architecture of my family dynamics. Uncle Marcus from Denver was already buying drinks for the cousins. Aunt Elaine stood near the entrance directing people toward the seating chart. When I walked past her, she offered a tight smile and asked if I was recovering from my little stomach bug. I nodded. Word had spread, but the narrative had been heavily curated by my mother. A ruptured organ requiring emergency surgery had been downgraded to a minor digestive issue. Across the room, Chloe sat in a plush armchair, surrounded by 3 aunts who were adjusting her shawl and asking if the air conditioning was too harsh for her lungs. I scanned the room and found Brenda near the outdoor patio. She was orchestrating the catering staff with sharp, quick hand gestures. She wore a tailored navy dress and held a clipboard tracking the evening schedule. I waited until the catering manager walked away before I approached her. I kept my voice low and even. I told her we needed to talk about the specialist payments. I told her I brought the paperwork to transfer the billing back to her and Tom. Brenda did not look at me. She checked a detail on her clipboard and sighed. Her tone was the audible equivalent of swatting a fly. Please do not do this today, Olivia. We have 70 guests, and the appetizers are running late. I stood my ground. I told her my bank transfer would stop at the end of the month, and she needed to sign the primary account holder release. I needed her to understand this was not a negotiation. Brenda finally turned to face me. Her expression hardened into a familiar mask of maternal disappointment. Your hospital stunt last month already derailed Chloe's therapy schedule, she said. She was so worried about you she missed 2 sessions. I cannot handle your financial dramatics on top of everything else. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. She had just categorized a life-threatening surgical emergency as a stunt. She viewed my internal bleeding as an inconvenience that disrupted my sister therapy appointments. In that exact moment, the fragile hope I had harbored evaporated. The idea that I could walk away quietly died right there on the patio. I realized you cannot negotiate a peaceful exit with a person who does not believe you have the right to exist outside their utility. I nodded, slowly stepped back, and let her return to her clipboard. Dinner commenced an hour later. The catering staff brought out plated meals while a hired string quartet played softly in the corner. I sat at table 9 near the kitchen doors. I was seated next to second cousins who spent the meal discussing their golf handicaps. Chloe sat at the head table next to Brenda and Tom. She picked at her food, while Brenda leaned over every few minutes to ask if she needed her inhaler. The performance of fragility was working flawlessly. The extended family watched with admiring eyes, offering sympathetic nods whenever Chloe coughed into her napkin. As the dessert plates were cleared, Brenda stood up. She picked up her water glass and tapped it with a butter knife. The sharp ringing cut through the chatter. The room settled into an expectant hush. Brenda walked to the microphone set up near the head table. She smiled at the room and thanked everyone for traveling to celebrate the family legacy. She spoke about unity. She spoke about the strength required to overcome challenges together. Then she turned her gaze toward Chloe. Her voice shifted into a fragile, trembling pitch. She talked about bravery. She told the 70 assembled guests that watching Chloe manage her daily anxiety and respiratory struggles was the most inspiring journey of her life. She framed a 30-year-old woman who still relied on her parents for daily functioning as a warrior battling invisible demons. The audience was captivated. Aunt Elaine wiped a tear from her cheek. Uncle Marcus raised his glass in a silent toast. I sat quietly watching the theater unfold. Then Brenda gripped the edges of the podium, and her eyes scanned the room until they found me sitting at table 9. The warmth in her voice vanished, replaced by a heavy, sorrowful tone. We learn so much from our children, she said. We learn about sacrifice from Chloe. And we learn about the painful realities of modern life from Olivia. The room went dangerously quiet. 70 heads turned slightly, trying to look at me without appearing to look. Brenda sighed into the microphone. We just wish Olivia could learn some of that resilience. Moving away and focusing only on herself has been a painful disappointment for this family. Sometimes the modern world teaches young women to abandon their roots for selfish pursuits. But true strength is staying. True strength is carrying the weight together. The words settled over the banquet hall like a heavy blanket. The relatives murmured in sympathetic agreement. I heard someone at the next table whisper a quiet word of support for Brenda. They did not know about the $600 a month. They did not know about the untreated medical conditions. They only knew the story Brenda had fed them. A story where she was the martyr mother caring for a sick child, while her eldest daughter abandoned them for a selfish life in the city. Brenda paused, gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles turned white. She did not look at me. Her eyes darted across the banquet hall, eagerly soaking in the sympathetic nods from the crowd. She fed on their collective pity. She needed the audience to validate her. I watched her posture relax, and her chest rise as Uncle Marcus whispered his agreement. She was physically building her defense in real time, using their approval as a shield, and my public humiliation as the mortar. I sat in my chair at table 9. My hands rested flat on the white linen tablecloth. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not stand up and shout. I did not run out of the room crying. Crying was the currency they expected. Crying would have confirmed her narrative that I was unstable and dramatic. Instead, I let the silence stretch. I listened to the shifting chairs and the uncomfortable coughing of extended family members. I realized then that a quiet boundary is a useless tool against a person who uses your silence as a shield. I had tried to manage this like an auditor. I had tried to close the account privately and move on. But Brenda had chosen to make the audit public. She wanted an audience to witness my submission. She wanted the room to judge me. I looked at Brenda, standing at the podium bathing in the sympathetic gaze of her siblings and cousins. I decided to give her exactly what she asked for. I pushed my chair back from table 9. I stood up, and I walked out the side door toward the parking lot to open my trunk. I stepped out of the rented banquet hall into the cool Los Angeles evening. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, cutting off the sound of applause. My mother was inside, accepting praise for a martyrdom she had fabricated. I walked across the dark asphalt of the parking lot. The ambient noise of the city wrapped around me. I heard the distant hum of traffic on the freeway. I heard the rustle of dry palm fronds moving in the wind. I did not rush. Rushing is a symptom of panic. I operated with the steady, measured pace of an auditor closing a fraudulent account. I reached my car and unlocked the trunk. The black binder rested exactly where I had placed it hours earlier. I ran my hand over the smooth plastic cover. Inside those rings sat 500 pages of institutional evidence. Intake forms, discharge summaries, pediatrician referrals that were never followed up on. The paper trail of my physical deterioration. I lifted the binder. It weighed several pounds. It felt like holding a decade of my own dismissed suffering. I closed the trunk. The metallic click of the latch sounded incredibly loud in the quiet lot. I turned back toward the building. I opened the doors and stepped back into the reception space. The air inside smelled of roasted meat and expensive perfume. The string quartet was playing a gentle background melody. 70 relatives were finishing their meals. Silverware clinked against china. Laughter drifted from the corner tables. Brenda was still standing near the podium. She was smiling warmly, holding a linen napkin, accepting the adoring gazes of her siblings. Tom sat beside her, projecting the quiet stoicism of a supportive husband. Chloe remained in her plush chair, taking small sips of water, basking in the center of the attention. I began my walk across the room. I did not look at the floor. I kept my posture straight. I faced the head table and looked directly forward. As I moved past table after table, the dynamic in the room began to shift. The visual anomaly of a woman carrying a massive black binder through a formal dinner caught their attention. The laughter at Uncle Marcus' table tapered off. Anna Lane paused halfway through a sentence. The silence did not happen instantly. It spread outward like water soaking through fabric. The clinking of glasses ceased. The string quartet noticed the change in the crowd and faltered. The cellist lowered his bow. Soon the only sound in the venue was the rhythmic tapping of my heels against the polished hardwood floor. I stopped directly in front of the head table. Brenda looked down at me from her position near the microphone. Her smile wavered, but she tried to maintain the performance. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer another patronizing comment about my sudden departure. I did not give her the opportunity. I lifted the binder, holding it with both hands. I positioned it directly over her empty dessert plate. I released my grip. The binder hit the table with a violent, heavy thud. The impact rattled the silverware and knocked over a half-full glass of water. The sharp sound echoed through the nearby microphone and blasted out over the venue speakers. Several guests jumped in their seats. Brenda gasped and stepped back, her chair scraping harshly against the floorboards. I said, "That is my complete medical history." My voice was calm. I did not yell. I did not let my pitch rise. The truth does not require volume. It only requires a clear delivery. I looked directly into her eyes. I told her it included 18 doctor-verified notes, where she refused my medical care to fund Chloe and her lifestyle. I told her it cost me an ovary. The color drained from Brenda's face. The confident matriarch vanished, leaving behind a woman cornered by her own documentation. She did not turn into an aggressive monster. People who build their lives on optical illusions do not engage in physical combat. They defend their script. She pressed her hands against her chest, and her breathing hitched. She began to sob defensively. The tears spilled over her cheeks, right on schedule. "We did the best we could," she cried out. Her voice shook, mirroring the exact fragility she usually assigned to her younger daughter. Chloe could have died. We had to protect her. Resistance rippled from the surrounding tables. Uncle Marcus stood up, pushing his chair aside. He told me this was a family celebration, and that I was upsetting my mother. He told me to put the binder away. Aunt Elaine chimed in from the front row, stating I was taking things out of context. She reminded me my sister had severe health issues. I did not engage with the gallery. I kept my focus locked on the head table. I looked at Tom, who was staring intently at his hands, refusing to intervene. Then I looked at Chloe. Chloe was breathing shallowly, performing her usual panic response, waiting for the room to rush to her aid. I observed her mild wheezing. I thought about the surgical scar on my abdomen. Chloe had mild asthma, I said. My voice cut through the ambient murmurs. I have permanent organ damage. I turned my attention back to Brenda. She was wiping her eyes with her napkin, looking around the room for salvation. I delivered the final line of my audit. The one piece of leverage that actually governed this family. I announced that effective Today's $600 monthly transfer for Chloe out-of-network care was canceled. The banquet hall fell into a suffocating silence. The defensive murmuring stopped. The shifting of chairs ceased. I heard the low mechanical hum of the building ventilation system. I heard a single sharp intake of breath from Aunt Elaine. Nobody stepped forward. Uncle Marcus slowly sat back down. A 500-page hospital record sitting on a table changes the geometry of an argument. It cannot be dismissed as a selfish outburst. It is a physical ledger. It demands to be reconciled. The financial reality of my statement stripped away the remaining theater. I was the underwriter of their golden child, and I was closing the bank. I stood upright, facing the crowd, looking directly forward. I surveyed the 70 relatives. I watched them process the realization that the villain they had just condemned was actually the victim they had ignored. I turned around and walked back down the center aisle. My footsteps were the only sounds accompanying me to the exit. I pushed the heavy doors open and left the building. The success was not clean. Quiet boundaries rarely end with cinematic applause. Walking out of that hall meant severing ties with my entire extended family. The next morning, my phone filled with messages that proved my point. A few cousins sent quiet texts asking if I was recovering well from surgery. However, most of the relatives chose the comfort of the familiar lie. Uncle Marcus sent a long message stating that family is about forgiveness, and that I was deeply selfish for ruining a beautiful evening. Aunt Elaine told me I was unforgiving and lacked grace. I did not reply to any of the messages. I blocked the numbers. I deleted the group threads. I accepted the cost of my freedom. I lost aunts, uncles, and parents. I lost the illusion of a family safety net. But the ledger is finally balanced. I kept my money. I hired my own specialists. I began the long, expensive process of treating the damage left behind by a decade of parental neglect. I sit in my apartment, now listening to the ambient sounds of the city outside my window. The distant traffic, the wind, the quiet breathing of a life that belongs entirely to me. I stopped paying the premiums for a family that never cared if I survived. And the quiet peace that followed is the most valuable asset I have ever owned.